Welcome back to another episode of The Burden of Proof. I'm your host, Tyler Lewis, and I'm joined as always by co-host Peter Crawford. Peter, how we doing?
Good, Tyler. How are you?
Good, good. So what are we diving into today?
So today's going to be all about DUIs. And for this discussion in and about DUIs, we brought in Angel Campbell, somebody who deals with a lot of DUIs on a weekly or monthly basis and who deals with the clients and the process and the procedure surrounding DUIs. So let's get into it.
Awesome. Welcome, Angel. Just a question off the bat. It's summertime now and the weather's getting nice. Do you kind of see an uptick in DUI charges going into the summer months as opposed to kind of in the winter, or does it stay kind of steady?
I think DUIs are kind of related to holidays, in my opinion. You got the July 4th, you have St. Patty's Day is a big one. So yeah, definitely I think in the summer people are getting out a little bit more, having a good time. So I don't know if I've noticed a big uptick, but I think the holidays definitely do impact it for sure.
Gotcha. Cool. So let's kind of dive into sort of what happens if you're charged with a DUI, so we can sort of start with the traffic stop, so kind of lay the scene for us. What kind of happens when you get pulled over? What can sort of people expect, and what should they do?
Yeah, so officer's going to pull you over because he observes some kind of traffic violation, right? So a lot of times with DUIs, we see poor driving, swerving, abruptly stopping, driving super slow. So first the officer's got to have a reason to pull you over. And then once he does, he kind of starts his whole like, okay, I pulled you over for this reason, but I smell alcohol, or where are you coming from, or this time of night, or they kind of ask you some questions that might indicate the term is that he has some kind of probable cause to believe that you've had some alcohol, right? So he will, at some point, he'll ask you some questions. You may, talk about where you've been, what you're doing, which is going to lead the officer to doing probably some tests if he believes that, if he's got a reasonable belief that you've had alcohol, he'll probably ask you to do some tests and kind of talk to you about it.
Gotcha. So what kind of tests can an officer administer at this point?
There are many. The normal ones are, we call them standard field sobriety tests. There's pretty basic 3 tests that officers will do. It's the horizontal gaze nystagmus test. You've probably seen it done. It's where the officer has like the pen and the light, and he's like, follow my pen. They do that test pretty regularly. They do this test called the walk and turn test, which is probably what you may have practiced in your college days of walking a straight line and then turning around and walking back. And then they have a one-leg stand test. That's a test where they want you to just stand there on one leg for 30 seconds. So those are kind of the basic tests. There are other tests. Sometimes they can get a DRE expert out there to do certain other tests.
What's a DRE expert?
A DRE is a drug recognition expert. So it's actually against the law to drive with alcohol in your system, which everyone knows that. But it could also be prescription drugs. It could also be marijuana now is a big thing with it being illegal in Maryland. So you can't always glean from those 3 basic tests whether somebody's impaired or not, and the officer might have to get another expert to come out and do different tests, like there's the backwards ABCs, or you've probably seen some of these tests before. Yeah, there are a lot of different ones, but we pretty much see those 3 main ones here in Maryland.
And they're just looking for like if you're wobbling while you're walking, or if you can't sort of form sentences.
Yeah, for sure. So fortunately, a lot of these incidents or interactions are recorded on body cam now, so you can tell pretty quickly if somebody's impaired or not. But yeah, there are certain, they call them clues. I think for the horizontal gaze nystagmus test, there are like 6 clues that the officer's looking for, and they indicate which ones they've seen. So with the horizontal gaze nystagmus test, a lot of times we see 6 out of 6 clues for somebody who has something in their system. Now the other tests are a little bit more subjective, in my opinion. That's where as attorneys we can make some pretty good arguments. So like the walk and turn test, I think they're looking for 8 clues there. And it can be, didn't count while they're also stepping. It's a little bit more subjective in my opinion. And then the one-leg stand test, I think there are 4 clues they're looking for, and that's kind of like you said, are they wobbly, are they steady, where are their hands, are they counting correctly? So there's different things they're looking for in those tests.
So you said those tests specifically test for alcohol, or is it alcohol, drugs, and marijuana?
So the standard field sobriety tests really are looking at, you know, the alcohol, maybe the marijuana, because it's looking at your stability and things like that. But those tests are not necessarily good for example, prescription drugs or for marijuana. You know, looking at whether you're stable or not might not be a good indication that there's something in your system. So there are other tests that they do, like on your eyes and on your other areas of your body. But primarily, those tests are really looking at alcohol, maybe marijuana at some point.
Have they come up with any breathalyzer tests specifically for marijuana yet? Or
Not yet. That's actually a really cool thing. You'll probably be a rich man if you figure it out.
Right.
Because no, right now we just got alcohol. So that's the other thing that happens is the officer will pull you over and say, you know, I believe you're impaired, and then have you blow, and you'll blow 0.0, but you're clearly messed up, right? So yeah, that's kind of what we're running into. I'm sure we're going to talk about the NVA implications of this too, and that kind of comes into play a lot with respect to that.
And back to the breathalyzer, can I, if they ask me, can I say no?
Yeah,
Or,
you can do what you want to do. So,
but what are the implications of doing
right,
that?
so that's the real question,
Right.
right? So if you have a Maryland driver's license, just by virtue of having the license, there's like a fine print that we don't really talk about, we don't really think about. But that fine print is basically saying that because I have this license, if an officer believes that I'm impaired under the influence, then I will agree to submit to a test, a breathalyzer test. That's what you're agreeing to just by having your license. So if you decide, no, I don't want to take the test, I mean, you have a right. You have constitutional rights to say, no, I don't want to do that. But what will happen is your privilege to drive, because driving is a privilege, may be suspended for up to 270 days if you refuse. That's 9 months. If you take the test and you come out with the test being positive, then your license can be suspended for up to 6 months. Now, there's ways around those, but essentially that's what you're looking at if you take or don't take the test.
Gotcha. Wow. Yeah, I didn't even realize there was that small fine print. Nobody even reads that. So it's crazy. Let's kind of dive into sort of what you mentioned before, the kind of two types of cases and sort of how they play out. So there's obviously the criminal charge, but there's also an MVA component as well.
That's right. So anytime you get pulled over for you know, DUI case, there's two things that happen. Number one is you've got to deal with that privilege about your license, right? And then the second, like you said, is you've got to deal with the court. Whenever we're dealing with court, we're saying you committed a crime here, so you can be subject to, you know, a year or 60 days, depending on your charge, of jail time. Whereas with your license, it's not, you can't really, you know, say you're going to go to jail for anything, but you can say, well, I don't think you should have this privilege. So each case, we have to deal with both of those things simultaneously. Now, when you go to court, even the court implications may involve the NBA. They're separate entities, but this one incident will have you dealing with both at the same time.
So what happens in that criminal side of it will affect the MVA.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So if you receive any convictions for anything under the DUI statutes, then that's going to have an impact on your license. Now the impact could be that, okay, you will let you still drive, but you need to only drive for certain purposes, or we'll let you drive, but you must participate in the ignition interlock program, or you're not going to be able to drive at all. You're going to have a suspension for 6 months. Depends on what happens in your case. Now, we always talk about PBJs, not the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? But probation before judgment, the reason why they're so important, because in Maryland, they're not seen as convictions, which means in a DUI case, if you receive that, you're not going to have additional penalties through the MVA. And that's what we want, right? We want the least amount of penalties as possible. The MVA, you know, they'll give you this whole speech about, we don't work for the MVA, we're not a part of it, this is separate. You know, and the judges give that speech, and the Office of Administrative Hearings also give those speeches to let you know that they're separate and apart, even though they feel like, you know, the same thing. It all arises out of that same incident.
And do they run concurrently, or is it like the criminal case will finish and figure out, and then the MVA case will go?
Yeah, it just kind of depends. So as far as any punishment against you, the statute actually says that it should run concurrently, because of the incident was,
Mhm.
this is all arose out of the same incident. But in reality and practically speaking, it kind of depends on which route you go, whether the issue is going to run concurrently or not. So, take for example an incident. You picked up a DUI on July 4th, right? So that incident took place that day. The MVA knows that you didn't blow because you didn't know that you had to blow. And so then you're dealing with the MVA about your license issue. They're going to try to do that right away.
Okay.
But you're not going to have a court date for several months,
Right.
more likely than not. So in that instance, you may have already done something or you're trying to do something with your license, but you haven't really actually gone to court. So it just kind of depends on where everything falls. But our job as your attorneys is to try to obviously have the least impact on you as possible.
Awesome. And you mentioned interlock devices. Kind of dive into what those are.
Yeah, it's not great.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody likes the interlock. It's just a blow and go in your car. I've seen a couple of them. They actually just look like cell phones that are connected to the electronic system in your car, and you've got to blow in it in order to turn your car on. So obviously, there's a lot of problems that can happen with respect to that, and sometimes we see them and we got to deal with those. But yeah, it's just a blow and go in
Are
your
those
car.
very common, or if like you get a first DUI, you wouldn't necessarily?
Every case is different. So
Yeah.
you can have a first DUI where you had an accident.
Depends on the severity. If they
Exactly. It really depends on that. It depends on if you blew or if you didn't blow. How much did you participate? Did you get a conviction or not? There's all sorts of factors that come into place when we're figuring out if you're going to have that or not.
I guess also kind of dive into, you can get a DUI, but there are also kind of a few other charges you could kind of get faced with depending on sort of what type of stop it was and everything. So if you
Right.
could dive into like
Yeah.
DUI versus DWI,
Mhm.
they kind of seem interchangeable, but they're different.
Yeah,
Aspects.
there's all different DUI, different types. So before we get there, though, let's go back to that traffic stop. So when you got pulled over, the officer had to have a reason. Maybe he says you were driving recklessly, or you were swerving, or you didn't stop at a red light. So you're going to get traffic citations anytime you receive this type of charges against you. But then you're also going to get, depending on your particular incident, you can be charged with driving under the influence of alcohol. That carries a year. And it's looking at, did you actually have something in your system that impaired your ability to operate a vehicle? Driving while impaired is a lower charge. It's very similar. Driving while impaired for our purposes carries a lower penalty of 60 days incarceration. The big thing between all of these is like how much was in your system and how poor was your driving, to put it in simple terms. But like I said earlier, DUI charges anticipate, prescription drugs, marijuana, and alcohol.
Gotcha. Yeah, because you kind of see both of those, and it's always kind of confusing. So it's based on, the difference is the severity. So based off of how much you blow, like what your
Correct.
test results come back as, and
Correct.
there's also that if you're egregiously driving, that's part of it as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So the statutes break it down a little bit more, but that's pretty much what we're looking at.
Gotcha. Cool. Then I guess sort of we can dive into, we touched on a little bit the sort of possible penalties, what you're looking at for first time DUI. Obviously, once you get the second and third, it gets a little more serious, but kind of if you could lay out sort of what you're looking at for a first time DUI with your license, the jail time, sort of if you have to get any sort of devices, just kind of walk us through that.
Yeah, so if it's your very first time, you don't have any criminal history, you don't have a really poor driving record, and we believe that the state can prove the case, they can prove that your driving was poor, the officer did have a valid reason to pull you over, there was alcohol in your system. On the first offense, the statutes only account for, like I said, a year in jail on a DUI and DUI per se, and then 60 days for the lower charges. Like you said, DUIs is really important to not have several, not get a second and third, because the statute accounts for if you do, you can get additional penalties. So like on a second offense, you might be looking at 2 years. Then if we keep going, you can get 5 years. And there's a certain point where the statute just like 10 years for this
Just
case.
throw them away.
Yeah.
Throw away the key.
Yeah, you
I mean,
know,
at
you
some
gotta
point-
stop doing
Yeah.
that.
At some point you gotta
So.
figure it out, but the penalties tend to compound. if you
Yeah,
get
it's
more and
a
more.
stepping stone. There's also additional penalties that, like I said, if you decided not to blow, you could receive additional jail time just for that.
Wow.
So yeah,
So were the penalties always like this? Because
no.
I heard back in the day it wasn't this bad, but obviously
Yeah.
was it like the 90s, the 80s, the early 2000s? Is that when it started to change? And you know why it changed?
Yeah, so you're kind of testing my historical knowledge.
Yeah.
My understanding of all that is it kind of relates back to a specific incident here in Maryland where like they were seeing, significant cases where people are just, riding down the street drinking. Obviously, the culture has changed a lot. We don't
Right.
just we put our seatbelts on. We don't grab our beer and
Right.
start
No,
driving.
I saw this one video on I think it was TikTok or YouTube
Yeah.
where this woman was driving with a beer and they hadn't outlawed drinking and driving yet. She's
Yeah.
like, I think it should be un-American not to drink and drive.
Right.
Like that's the thought process people used to have. They didn't think it was that
You're
dangerous.
absolutely right.
crazy.
You're absolutely right. What happened is, people started getting hurt and
Right.
a lot of really, really bad accidents. There was a really bad one here in Maryland that kind of led to them saying, okay, Noah's laws, we gotta change all this.
Right.
But you're right. Though.
Yeah.
It used to be a cool thing. I know, like my grandfather,
Right.
Well, the cars used to be different too, right?
Yeah.
You couldn't drive 100 miles an hour down
Right.
the highway back then in your 64 Ford.
Right.
You know, you
And
probably
that
got,
big
like,
body.
top speed of 50 miles
Yeah,
an hour.
right.
Yeah. It's
crazy.
probably the car's so big and sturdy too. I guess probably not much is gonna happen to anybody.
Yeah, exactly.
But I mean, it's so prevalent nowadays. These
Yeah.
things are needed. I mean,
Yeah.
you see every weekend there's somebody going out getting into an accident, and they might have had something in their system.
Right.
Especially with legalization of marijuana, that brings more aspects and more sort of substances to be able to abuse while driving. So I definitely see the merit that we have to kind of get an increase to stop that.
Yeah, I mean, who doesn't know somebody from high school that died from DUI? Or like, have you never seen like the side of the road with like the cross and the flowers? Like,
Yeah,
I
they're
feel
all
like,
over.
yeah, they are. So I mean, it's definitely prevalent within society. It's definitely picked up over the last probably 40 years.
Yeah, definitely, 100%.
So yeah, just to kind of go along and dive more into this, are DUIs expungible? I'm sure you see a lot of expungements. Is this something that could be eligible for an expungement?
As we sit here today, right this second, no, they're not.
Okay.
But that actually is changing. So in October of this year, we're expecting to see DUIs become eligible for expungements.
Wow.
So what the thought process used to be that, well, we need to be able to keep up with how many you've had because obviously there are graduated penalties like we talked about depending on if it's your first, second, or whatever. But it just kind of seems unfair. You can go get a really bad assault case or, get certain other cases and you can get them expunged. And so finally legislators have come around to changing that and DUIs are going to be eligible for expungement. It looks like they're saying, after 15 years of having nothing, no additional cases, then you will be able to expunge them. So there's certain other requirements, but yeah, they're working on changing that so that as of October this year, DUIs will be expungible.
Do you even know why they weren't eligible? Because it seems like maybe.
I don't think it's fair. Obviously, I'm a criminal defense
Right.
attorney, right? You want me to hold on to something from 30 years ago, right? And normally, a lot of the cases we have where they have multiples, it was a prior from like 1990 or something. They were in college, like Pete said, or high school or something like that. So it just, like I said, it just kind of seems unfair. The statute did provide for if it's more than 10 years, they might not go so hard on you or whatever, but I think that's all it was is, not only has the mindset changed about us receiving these types of charges in the first place, but then also, expungement, you should be able to expunge something like this. And we can, if you haven't had it in 15 years, we'll cut you a break.
I mean,
think that's fair.
You shouldn't still be penalized for some dumb mistake you made as a kid. And if it's just one from 15 years ago, I mean, why wouldn't you at least take a look at it? So it's interesting that that's finally changing, and I'm sure we'll see a lot of those kind of pick up coming through because there were people probably with a DUI from 20 years ago
Yeah.
that's still sitting there, and they're like, oh, I should probably get it expunged.
Yeah. Most people that I encountered, they catch it one time and that's the end of it. And I believe those sorts of people should be eligible and should receive the expungements on their records.
People make mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you also mentioned PPJ, so kind of talk to us how you could get a probation before judgment on a DUI. Is it just like it has to be your first one, or is it dependent on a case? Sort of walk us through kind of.
Yeah, so officially you're eligible if it's your first,
Okay.
and you're eligible if you haven't had one within 10 years. That's, official. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, it's very fact-based of what happened in your incident. If you didn't hurt anybody, if your driving wasn't so poor, you had an accident, if you cooperated with the officer, then you're going to be eligible for that probation before judgment. Again, this is assuming that the state can prove the case against you. And so that's what we want, right? This is not going to, blow up most people's lives. They will have to get counsel and make sure that they're guided through the process the right way to ensure that. But yeah, probation before judgment is what we want if they can prove your case, and you're eligible for that on the first offense.
Cool, thank you.
Anything else?
No, I think we kind of covered. It was a good sort of overview to kind of go from the beginning of when you sort of got pulled over and what to expect down the line. So yeah, I mean, be careful out there. I know it's nice out, but remember not to drink and drive because you don't necessarily want to end up with a charge.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah, thank
Don't
you.
drink and drive, people.
Yeah.
We're here, but don't use us.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the time, Angel.
Of
We
course.
really appreciate it.
Of
And
course.
Pete, as always, thank you.
And nice dialogue.
And stay tuned for the next episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.